At the edge of a forgotten kingdom, where the hills rose like silent sentinels and the wind carried stories no one dared finish, there lay a village pressed between two truths: the safety of their customs and the shadow of the forest. Just beyond, the trees stood a broken stone castle, draped in ivy and silence. Its towers leaned like old men weary of standing, and its windows were empty eyes watching a world that had tried to forget them. No one lived there. Not anymore. But children were still warned to keep their distance, and elders still left bread on the boundary stones when the moon grew red. The castle was not merely ruins, it was memory. And memory, in this village, never died cleanly. The villagers lived as their grandfathers did, hands in the soil, lips full of prayer, and hearts tightly locked. Every tale carved into their bones warned of pride, of promises broken and blood made to answer for old sins. The forest whispered at night, the kind of whisper that slipped into dreams. And though the sun shone freely, every shadow in the village felt like something watching. Into this heavy silence walked Elias. He was no ordinary boy. With hair like ash and eyes that danced like flame, Elias moved through the village like a jest, bright, sharp, and never still. He laughed at the mutterings of elders, made faces at the painted charms above doorways, and dared to walk near the cursed stone path leading toward the castle ruins. "Fear makes fools," he often said, tossing pebbles at the shrine of the silent saints. Some called him brave, a youth with fire in his heart. Others whispered of arrogance. He didn't care. To Elias, fear was weakness, and the village was full of cowards clinging to dead stories. What they called curses, he called bedtime tales. But beneath his mocking smile lived a hunger. Elias's family name had once rung through these hills, like a war drum, full of honor and wealth. Now it lay in the dust, spat at behind closed doors. His father sat daily at the hearth, polishing a sword he hadn't drawn in years, while his mother's voice grew hoarse from prayers that seemed to reach no one. Elias was not just laughing at shadows, he was daring the past to notice him. And it did. Elias's lineage was a wound stitched too late. His grandfather had been a duke, respected, feared, and betrayed. Rumors said he had broken a sacred oath and that his bloodline was cursed with ruin and madness. The old songs no longer sang of his house, they hissed warnings instead. Now, the estate stood on a hill of sorrow, beautiful and broken. Its tapestries were faded, its gates rusted shut. And still, Elias walked its halls with restless defiance, pretending not to see the cobwebs draped like mourning veils. His father clung to the shreds of pride, still wearing the old crest on his cloak while his mother wept over letters never answered. In every stone of their home was the sound of something waiting. Once a year, when the frost broke and the first fireflowers bloomed, the village came alive in celebration. The Festival of Fires was meant to chase away darkness with masked dances, roaring bonfires, and tales sung by torchlight. Drummers called to the heavens, and children played games of luck and mischief. The wine flowed. The air smelled of roast lamb and smoke. It was a time to forget. But the stories, those never died. Between laughter and drink, someone would always begin a tale. Of fallen knights, of godly punishment, of promises broken and paid for in blood. Elias, of course, laughed the loudest. He stood by the fire, face painted with mockery, telling his own twisted versions of the old tales. "Be careful," he called, throwing an arm around a nervous boy. "Speak too loud, and the wind might carry your name to a ghost." People chuckled nervously, but in the silence that followed, a different voice answered. From the edge of the gathering stepped a man cloaked in dark wool, the firelight dancing across a face as lined as old bark. His eyes, gray and too clear, settled the crowd like snow on branches. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a voice like dry leaves stirring in wind, he began a tale It was about a noble house, proud and rising, brought to ruin by its own broken word, a duke who defied a sacred pact, a child born under a moonless sky. The words moved like smoke, curling into the hearts of those listening. Every word was like a mirror, and when the man spoke the family's name, Elias's name, a gasp slid through the crowd like a knife through silk. Elias's smirk froze. His cup slipped from his hand and shattered. Around him, the crowd turned, silent and slow. The fire crackled, but no one laughed. The tale was too close, too real. It didn't feel like a story. It felt like a sentence. He stumbled away from the circle, face pale, breath quick. The night no longer felt warm. The music had turned sharp. Every face looked like judgment, and the shadows stretched longer than they should. At home, the fire was still burning. His father stood near it, not surprised. He didn't ask what happened. Instead, he looked at Elias with eyes hollowed by years of silence. "You think the past is dead because you do not listen," he said. "But blood remembers, and names call out to themselves." Elias opened his mouth to speak, but the words betrayed him. He saw now that the stories weren't simply tales. They were warnings wrapped in song. His father's voice cracked with regret. "We mocked the saints, broke the vow, laughed at truth. Now truth has laughed back." Elias turned away, anger shielding the fear rising in him. But as he walked down the hall, he could still hear it. That storyteller's voice echoing like prophecy through his skull. And for the first time in his life, Elias didn't laugh. At first, Elias thought it was a prank. His name, scratched into the rough bark of the oldest tree near the forest's edge, felt like the work of a bored child or a wandering drunk. But the letters were too clean, too deep, as if carved not by a blade, but by time itself. He laughed it off, loud and theatrical, trying to chase away the strange chill that climbed his spine. But then came the owls. At dawn, when no bird should hoot, they circled over his roof in slow, perfect orbits, eyes glowing gold in the dim light. Winds began to whisper at night, their voices pressing against his window, whispering not words, but warnings. Still, he made jokes. Still, he smirked. But beneath that smirk, something ancient and cold began to wake. Each night, his dreams twisted into something no mind should carry. He saw a knight wrapped in rusted chains, dragged across stone by faceless shadows. The knight cried out in a voice too familiar. He wore a sigil shaped like a silver flame, one Elias had only seen once, etched into the corner of an old family crest hidden beneath dust. The chains snapped, and blood spilled across the dreamscape like ink on parchment. Elias would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, the echo of steel and shame ringing in his ears. He knew these weren't just nightmares. These dreams didn't belong to him. They belonged to someone long dead, someone whose sins still bled through the generations. On the third night, shaken and desperate, Elias did something he had once mocked. He searched. Beneath the fireplace stone where his mother once told him never to play, he found a hollow space. Inside lay a scroll, aged and brittle, sealed in red wax that had long since cracked. The words were written in ink, faded by firelight, but they burned into his soul as if branded. His great-grandfather, a knight of the king's inner circle, had once sworn an oath in blood to defend the kingdom's sacred border. But when battle came, he fled. No one saw him die. No one saw him fight. His betrayal was hidden, locked away by frightened sons who feared disgrace more than justice. In punishment, a pact was sworn, one that blood would carry. Every fourth generation a child would suffer the shame, until a descendant stood and restored the name, or perished trying. Scroll in hand, Elias stormed to his father. "You knew," he said, voice trembling with fury. His father stood silent at first, the lines in his face deepening like cracks in stone. "It's not for you to fix," the old man finally said. "It is our burden. We carry it quietly, as men should." Elias slammed the scroll onto the table. "Silence is not honor. Silence is fear." His father's eyes flashed. "You would shout our disgrace to the wind? Destroy what little respect we have left?" The room thickened with years of unsaid words. Father and son bound by the same curse, divided by what to do with it. The fire crackled behind them, bearing witness to the war that had begun without swords. By morning, the village had changed. Doors that once opened for Elias now closed. Women glanced away. Children whispered. The storyteller's tale had taken root, twisting into rumor. "He's cursed," someone muttered behind a market stall. "That blood calls for fire," said another. Elias tried to smile, to jest, but no one laughed. Their silence was a noose, and each step he took felt lonelier than the last. In search of clarity, he wandered to the graveyard, where the willow tree bent like an old man's back. There sat the blind minstrel, white eyes staring into memory. "You mock what you do not understand," the old man said without being asked. "But laughter has never buried the dead, boy." Elias knelt, startled. "What do you know?" The minstrel tilted his head. "I know the past has teeth, and it bites those who bare their throat in arrogance." His voice cracked, not with age but grief, as if he, too, had watched a bloodline fall. Later, Elias returned home, hoping for support. Instead, he was met with silence and fire. His uncle refused to speak. His sister wept, clutching his hand, begging him to stop. "We've lived this long. Why stir what sleeps?" she whispered. His father roared. "You would ruin us." Elias's voice shook the walls. "We are already ruined, but I will not pass this curse to my children." The house shook not from noise, but from the truth laid bare. Elias turned and left, his footsteps heavy, but his will unshaken. Now, he stands at a crossroads. Behind him lies silence, shame, and a name rotting from within. Before him, the forest looms, dark but honest. He could let the curse fester, or he could face what no man in his line dared to. The wind stirred again, carrying the same whisper it always did. But now he understood the words. The forest was calling, and Elias was ready to answer. The night offered no stars, no moon, only a sky thick and heavy like an old sorrow refusing to pass. Elias walked alone, the path into the forest crunching beneath his boots as if the earth recognized his blood. In his hand, a stub of candle sputtered in the wind, its flame dancing over the verses of the storyteller's parchment. He held it close, the old ink smudging from his thumb. Trees loomed like towers from another age, their bark gnarled with time and secrets. Each breath he took rose into the air like ghost smoke, and it felt as though unseen eyes were watching, some with pity, others with judgment. Every step deeper echoed not in sound, but in memory, as if the past whispered in the silence. Center of the forest, the darkness broke, not with sunlight, but with a pale green glow as fireflies floated upward like drifting souls. Mist curled around Elias's feet, and then, from the fog, shapes began to form. Figures clad in cloaks of faded time. They didn't speak, but their faces bore the marks of his family. Stern brows, weary eyes, hands once used for labor or war. In their midst knelt one man in rusted phantom armor, chains wrapping his body like vines, eyes hollow with centuries of shame. Elias recognized the sigil on his chest, the crest of a knight who once defended the kingdom but chose fear over honor. The murmurs rose around him, an echo of stories never told, oaths broken in blood. Elias listened, his mouth dry as they told of loyalty turned to disgrace, of laughter that mocked truth, of a sin not buried but passed down like a curse. The weight of it all pressed against his chest like armor too large for the boy he once was. Then the spirits moved aside, and from the roots of an ancient tree emerged a strange glow. Beneath twisted bark and blackened soil lay something sealed, a relic, forged not of gold or steel, but of sorrow and memory. The spirits spoke not with words, but through the aching silence in Elias's heart. He understood. He could take the relic and use its power to shape his destiny, to bend fate in his favor, or he could reject it and choose humility, offering up his name, his life, as penance for generations of silence. One path held control, the other redemption. His fingers trembled, his lips parted, but no words came. The weight of choice hung heavier than any chain. A low growl pierced the air. The mist swirled violently, and from the trees burst a creature unlike any Elias had seen. A massive black wolf, eyes glowing, eyes that burned with something painfully familiar. They were his father's eyes. In that beast, Elias saw all the unspoken fury, the fear of disgrace, the pride that bound generations like iron cuffs. The wolf circled him, hackles raised, voice echoing not from its mouth but from within his blood. Will you fight your past or forgive it? The beast shimmered between forms, now a man with a sword of flame, now a boy cowering in shame. Then, back to the wolf again. Elias stood frozen. He did not know if he should weep or draw steel. Instead, he stepped forward. He lifted the relic, its glow now steady, then knelt. Not to the beast, not to the ancestors, but to truth. His voice, steady and solemn, cut through the air. I name each sin, he whispered, not to condemn, but to remember. One by one, he spoke their names. His great-grandfather who fled battle, his grandfather who burned the scrolls, his father who chose silence over healing. I am their witness, Elias said. I carry their shame, not to wear it like armor, but to break its chain. The wolf let out a cry, not of rage, but of sorrow, and its body dissolved into wind. The chains around the kneeling knight shattered into light, and the forest exhaled a long, tired breath. The curse, fed by denial, crumbled before a single act of truth. Morning came soft and slow, as if the forest itself were recovering from a long illness. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams, and dew sparkled on the leaves. Elias walked back to the village without fanfare. No sword at his side, no banners trailing behind, just the quiet peace of a soul that had faced its reflection. He passed through the gates, and though no words were spoken, the air had changed. Doors opened, curtains were drawn back. A child stepped forward, looked up at him, and took his hand. No one mentioned the curse. No one needed to. In a world that often hid from the past, Elias had spoken it aloud, and that, more than magic, had broken the spell. The gates of the village creaked open just as the first gold rays of dawn brushed against the rooftops. Elias stepped through, cloaked in silence. He carried no sword, no prize, not even a tale on his lips. But his eyes held the weight of 100 winters, of fire and forgiveness and nights spent in the company of ghosts. His step was measured, no longer light with laughter or arrogance. Children peered at him from behind cracked doors, clutching their mother's skirts. The baker's wife crossed herself. An old woman near the well whispered, "He has returned, changed." And though no bell rang, the moment felt sacred. He had left as a boy who mocked stories. Now he returned carrying them in his bones. The village did not rush to greet him. At first, there were only whispers, half curious, half fearful. Is that the cursed one's blood? Did he truly face the beast? But as the sun climbed, so did understanding. The blacksmith, thick with soot and pride, gave a slow, silent nod. The butcher's daughter, once cruel with her laughter, dropped her gaze in apology. A widow left a basket of bread at his doorstep, without a word. By the time the fire pits lit up that night, the voices had changed. They no longer whispered of shame, but of courage. "He went where none dared," someone murmured, and he came back with something different. Around the crackling flames, stories shifted shape, not of omens and curses, but of truth, of a man who faced what others feared and lived to walk among them again. As weeks passed, the elders gathered the children in the square beneath the storyteller's tree. This time, they spoke the tale not as a warning, but as a lesson carved in sorrow and stitched in hope. "Pride split the bloodline," one graybeard said, but it was humility that stitched it whole. The children, wide-eyed, listened as the tale unfolded, how Elias walked into the woods not for glory, but to mend a broken story. The curse was no longer a shadow to fear, but a memory to learn from. "Even broken songs," the old storyteller said, lifting a gnarled finger, "can still be sung, if sung with truth." The manor on the hill, once dark and shuttered, began to change. Elias opened its doors, not to restore its riches, but to redeem its name. Dust was swept from old portraits. The windows, once sealed like tombs, now welcomed light. He invited in the forgotten, the grieving, the shamed, the wounded. No titles were spoken, no judgments passed. They shared bread, confessions, and silence, and the manor, once a house of disgrace, began to glow with quiet hope. Between cold stone walls, laughter returned, not sharp and mocking, but soft and true. Children played in halls once heavy with ghosts. Elders rested in rooms warmed not by fire alone, but by forgiveness. And from those walls, new songs were heard, low and steady, rising from the ashes of what was once broken. On the first night of frost, Elias sat beneath the old tree, a carving knife in hand. On a wooden board he etched names, his father's, his grandfather's, his own. He carved not just for memory, but for meaning. Around him the villagers gathered, not as followers, but as companions. They sat in silence, warmed by fire, their breaths rising in silver threads. Elias looked up, his voice soft but certain. "Stories can wound," he said, "but they can also bind us. They remind us who we are and who we could become." A hush followed. Then an old man with a harp began to hum the old tale. But this time, it was different. This time, Elias's name was not the one to fear, but the one to remember. A name sung with reverence, not regret. The story had not ended. It had healed, and in its healing the village found its voice once more.